What happens when a single venomous complaint aboard a flight ignites a firestorm of consequences? This isn't just a story about an argument over a seat. It's about a woman who was pushed too far and had the power to push back in a way no one could have imagined. It's a story of quiet dignity versus loud prejudice, of corporate power and the devastating, life-altering boomerang of karma. We're about to board United Flight 22447, where a first-class ticket became a battlefield. A multi-million-dollar empire was put at risk, and one family learned that the price of bigotry is far higher than the cost of an airline seat. Stay with me, because the final twist is more shocking than you can possibly predict. Dr. Evelyn Reed believed in order. Her life a meticulously constructed edifice of discipline and intellectual rigor depended on it. As the founder and CEO of Alethea Dynamics, a pioneering AI ethics and data security firm, she navigated a world of complex algorithms and multi-billion-dollar contracts. Her mind was her fortress, and calm was its foundation. On this Tuesday morning in September, that calm was already fraying. She was flying from her home base in San Francisco, SFO, to New York, JFK, for the most important meeting of her career. For months, the corporate behemoth Omnicorp had been courting Alethea Dynamics for an acquisition. The number being floated was astronomical, a figure that would not only make Evelyn and her early partners extraordinarily wealthy, but would also give her technology the global platform she'd always dreamed of. The final presentation was tomorrow. Everything had to be perfect. Her first-class ticket on United Flight 2447 was a non-negotiable part of that perfection. 6 hours of relative peace to review her presentation, to mentally spar with the Omnicorp board, and to simply breathe. She settled into seat 2B, a spacious pod in the Polaris cabin, the scent of fresh coffee and the low murmur of fellow travelers a familiar comfort. She was dressed in a tailored navy blue pantsuit, her hair styled in elegant micro-braids pulled back from her face. She was the picture of serene authority. Then Patricia Carmichael arrived. Patricia, who insisted everyone call her Patty, moved through the world as if it were a slightly disappointing hotel she was begrudgingly staying at. She was in her late 50s, draped in a cream-colored cashmere shawl that probably cost more than the flight attendant's monthly salary. Her face was a mask of polite dissatisfaction, and her eyes scanned the cabin, cataloguing every detail that fell short of her expectations. Her husband, Robert, a man whose expensive suit couldn't hide his air of weary resignation, followed a few steps behind, dragging their carry-ons. They were in seats 2C and 2D. Patty's seat 2C was directly across the aisle from Evelyn. Evelyn offered a brief professional nod as Patty approached. It was the standard unspoken greeting of first-class travelers. "I acknowledge your existence, and now I will respectfully ignore you for the duration of this flight." Patty did not return the nod. Instead, her eyes flickered over Evelyn from her braids to her laptop bag, and a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening creased the corners of her mouth. She stowed her purse with a sigh, as if the effort were a great burden, and sank into her seat. Evelyn, sensing the shift in atmosphere, put in her noise-cancelling earbuds and tried to focus on her presentation deck. The flight was still boarding, but she could feel Patty's gaze on her. It was a heavy, judgmental weight. A few minutes later, Patty leaned across the aisle, tapping her lacquered nail on Evelyn's armrest. Evelyn slid one earbud out. "Yes." "I was just wondering." Patty began, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper that carried a sharp edge. if you might be more comfortable in a different seat." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry." "Well, it's just," Patty continued, gesturing vaguely around the cabin. "This section is, you know. Sometimes the airline makes mistakes with the seating charts. They might have a spot that's a better fit for you." The implication was as thick and suffocating as smog. "You don't belong here." It wasn't a new sentiment for Evelyn. She had faced it in boardrooms, at academic conferences, and in high-end restaurants. It was the soft bigotry of lowered expectations and silent judgment. But here in this confined space, it felt particularly claustrophobic. "I can assure you," Evelyn said, her voice perfectly level, "Seat 2B is an excellent fit." "Thank you." She replaced her earbud, a clear signal that the conversation was over. But Patty wasn't finished. She huffed a small, indignant sound and turned to flag down the nearest flight attendant. A young woman with a warm, professional smile and a name tag that read Sarah hurried over. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" "Not really," Patty said, her voice now loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "I'm not comfortable with my seating arrangement. I paid a great deal for this ticket, and I have certain expectations. I need to be moved." Sarah's smile tightened slightly. "I understand, ma'am. Unfortunately, the first-class cabin is completely full. There are no other seats available." "Then she can be moved," Patty said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at Evelyn. "I don't know how she got this seat. Maybe it was an upgrade or a mistake, but I am a Global Services member and I am not comfortable sitting here. I feel unsafe." The word hung in the air, ugly and poisonous. Unsafe. The cabin fell silent. The man in 1B lowered his newspaper. The couple in 3A and 3B stopped their conversation. Everyone was looking. Evelyn felt a hot flush of anger creep up her neck. Decades of composure, of being twice as good, to get half as much, of swallowing microaggressions, to keep the peace, all of it threatened to boil over. She had spent her life building a fortress of dignity, and this woman was trying to tear it down with a wrecking ball of casual racism. Sarah, the flight attendant, was caught in the crossfire. Her training manual had no protocol for this. "Ma'am," she said, her voice strained, "Dr. Reed is a ticketed first-class passenger just like you. I cannot move her based on your preference." "It is not a preference. It's a matter of comfort and security." Patty's voice rose, cracking with entitlement. "I want to speak to your purser, or the captain. This is unacceptable." Evelyn watched the scene unfold, a strange sense of detachment settling over her. She saw Patty not as a person, but as a problem, an algorithm of prejudice that needed to be solved. And in that moment, as Patty berated the flustered flight attendant, a new equation formed in Evelyn's mind. It was audacious. It was extravagant. It was, she decided, the only logical solution. She calmly removed her other earbud, closed her laptop, and stood up. The sudden movement drew all eyes to her. She looked not at Patty, but directly at the beleaguered flight attendant. "Sarah," Evelyn said, her voice clear and resonant in the tense silence. "It seems the issue here isn't with my seat, but with my presence in this entire cabin. So let's solve that." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. "Please get your purser. I would like to purchase every remaining seat in first class." The silence that followed Evelyn's declaration was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the Boeing 777. Passengers stared, mouths slightly agape. Patty Carmichael's face which had been flushed with indignant rage, went slack with disbelief. Even Sarah, the flight attendant, looked as though she'd been struck by lightning. I'm sorry, Dr. Reed," Sarah stammered, unsure if she had heard correctly. "You want to—" "What I want to buy the seats." Evelyn repeated, her tone as calm as if she were ordering a coffee. "All of them. In this cabin. There are 16 Polaris seats in total. I'm in one. Mrs. Carmichael and her husband are in 2. That leaves 13 occupied seats. I would like to purchase them. Whatever the cost, I will pay for each passenger to be compensated, upgraded if possible, on a future flight, and moved to the best available seat in Economy Plus for this flight. And I will pay the full last-minute fare for each of their first-class seats. My intention is to fly to New York in a private cabin." She pulled her wallet from her laptop bag and produced a sleek black credit card. The American Express Centurion card. The black card. It wasn't just a payment method. It was a statement. It was a piece of metal and plastic that spoke a language people like Patty Carmichael understood far better than decency, the language of immense, indisputable wealth. Patty finally found her voice. "That's ridiculous. You can't do that," she sputtered, looking around for support that wasn't there. Her husband, Robert, finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of the situation. He put a restraining hand on her arm, his face pale. "Patty, for God's sake, just sit down," he hissed. The purser, a distinguished-looking man named David, had arrived, drawn by the commotion. Sarah quickly briefed him in a hushed, frantic whisper. David looked from the furious Patty to the composed Evelyn, his experienced eyes taking in the entire, unprecedented scene. "Dr. Reed," David said, approaching her cautiously. "That is a highly unusual request." "These are highly unusual circumstances," Evelyn countered smoothly. "Mrs. Carmichael feels unsafe due to my presence. I am simply providing a solution that ensures her perceived safety and my peace. I need to work on this flight. I cannot do so under these conditions. So is it possible or not?" David understood the subtext perfectly. This wasn't about a seat. It was a public high-stakes showdown over racism, and Dr. Reed had just deployed a financial nuclear option. Refusing her could create a massive PR nightmare for United. A black woman, a CEO being effectively harassed out of her paid seat by another passenger. The headlines wrote themselves, but accommodating her was a logistical hurricane. Let me speak with the captain and ground control," David said, his mind racing. "Please, if everyone could just take their seats for a moment." He disappeared toward the cockpit. The cabin buzzed with hushed conversations. Patty Carmichael sat stiffly in her seat, her face a thunderous mask of humiliation. She had tried to wield her privilege like a club, and had instead run head-first into a titanium wall. Evelyn returned to her seat and opened her laptop, projecting an aura of unbothered focus, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. She was taking a colossal financial gamble, not to mention a social one. But the principle of the matter had become a non-negotiable term. This was her company's ethos in miniature. You do not allow bad actors to corrupt the system. You isolate them. 10 minutes later, David returned. He knelt beside Evelyn's seat, speaking in a low, deferential tone. "Dr. Reed," he began. "We have spoken with our corporate office. They have authorized the transaction. It will be complicated, but we can do it." A wave of relief so profound it was almost dizzying washed over Evelyn. "Excellent," she said. What followed was a masterclass in controlled chaos. David and Sarah moved through the first-class cabin, speaking to each passenger individually. They explained the situation with extreme discretion, never mentioning Patty's complaint, only that an unforeseen circumstance has arisen and another passenger has made an offer to purchase the entire cabin for privacy. They offered each passenger a full refund of their first-class ticket, a $2,500 travel voucher, and the best available seat in the back of the plane. Most passengers, after a moment of stunned surprise, accepted with something resembling glee. A free flight to New York, plus a bonus. It was an incredible deal. One man, a businessman, who grumbled about needing to work, was placated when Evelyn personally authorized an additional $1,000 voucher for him. The process took nearly 45 minutes, delaying the flight's departure. The last passengers to be addressed were Patty and Robert Carmichael. David approached their seats. "Mr. and Mrs. Carmichael," he said formally, "the same offer extends to you. A full refund travel vouchers, and we have 2 seats for you in Economy Plus." Patty's face contorted. "Absolutely not. I paid for this seat. I am not moving." "Patty." Robert pleaded, his voice tight with desperation. "Just take the deal. Let's just go." "No. This is my seat. She is doing this to humiliate me." David's professional patience finally wore thin. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping the deferential tone and taking on a steely command. "Let me be very clear. The passenger in seat 2B has purchased this seat. And this one. And every other seat in this cabin. This is now for the duration of the flight to JFK, her private cabin. You are welcome to accept our generous compensation package and move to the seats we have reserved for you. Or you can be escorted off the aircraft and booked on a later flight. The choice is yours." The finality in his voice was absolute. Defeated, humiliated, and shaking with silent fury. Patty Carmichael stood up. Without a word, she grabbed her purse and, with her husband trailing apologetically, made the walk of shame down the aisle, past the curtain, separating the classes, and into the crowded economy section. The cabin door was finally sealed. The jet bridge retracted, as the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. David returned to Evelyn's seat one last time. "Dr. Reed," he said, a hint of awe in his voice. "The cabin is yours. The flight time to New York will be 5 hours and 42 minutes. The entire Polaris crew is at your personal disposal. Can we get you anything to start? A glass of champagne? Perhaps." Evelyn looked around the empty, silent cabin. The 16 pods, usually filled with the quiet rustle of business and leisure, were empty. It was an absurd, surreal sight. It was a victory, but it felt strangely hollow. She hadn't wanted this. She had simply wanted peace. "Yes, David," she said with a weary sigh. "Champagne would be lovely. And please tell your crew to take it easy. I suspect it will be a very quiet flight." As the plane lifted off, banking over the San Francisco Bay, Evelyn sipped her champagne and stared out the window. She had won the battle. She had no idea she was flying directly into the war. The 5 hours and 42 minutes to New York passed in a state of dreamlike solitude. For the first hour, Evelyn felt a grim satisfaction. She had drawn a line in the sand with a platinum credit card. The flight attendants, freed from their usual duties, treated her with a mixture of reverence and curiosity, offering her anything she desired from the galley. She ate her meal in peace, spread her presentation notes across the empty seat beside her, and for a moment savored the sheer, unadulterated quiet. But the silence soon became its own kind of noise. The empty seats around her weren't just empty. They were monuments to an ugly confrontation. The victory felt Pyrrhic. The cost of the transaction wasn't the eye-watering figure that would appear on her Amex statement that was just money. The real cost was the stark reminder that no matter how high she climbed, how much she achieved, her very presence could be deemed an offense by someone like Patty Carmichael. She pulled out her phone, connecting to the plane's Wi-Fi, and sent a message to her co-founder and chief technology officer, Marcus Vance. Evelyn, you are not going to believe the start to this trip. Marcus, don't tell me. Flight delayed. They lost your luggage already. Evelyn, worse, had to buy out the entire first-class cabin. The 3 dots indicating Marcus was typing appeared and disappeared several times. Marcus, come again. Did you miss a word? Did you mean you bought a new pillow? Evelyn quickly typed out a summary of the incident with Patty Carmichael. Marcus Evelyn, you are my hero, and also completely insane. Are you serious? You bought the whole cabin. Evelyn, what was I supposed to do? Let her win. Let her spew that poison and force me to move. It was a business decision. She was a hostile variable, disrupting a critical operation. I neutralized the variable. Marcus. You neutralized her with the force of a small nation's GDP. I'm impressed and a little terrified. But seriously, are you okay? That's awful. Evelyn. I'm fine. Just angry. And taunt. Makes tomorrow's meeting feel even more critical. I didn't build Alethea for me. I built it to create systems that prevent exactly this kind of biased decision-making. Selling to Omnicorp puts that philosophy on the world stage. Marcus, I get it. Well, use the quiet. Recenter. You're about to walk in there and blow them away. Don't let some miserable woman from Seat 2C throw you off your game. By the way, the lead from Omnicorp on this is their CFO, Robert something or other, right? Hope he's more reasonable than your flight companion. Evelyn's CFO is Robert P. Carmichael. I've read his file. Hard-nosed old school, but supposedly fair. Can't be any worse than his wife. Evelyn stared at the name on her screen. Carmichael. A cold knot formed in her stomach. It had to be a coincidence. Carmichael wasn't an uncommon name. The world was large, but it wasn't that small. She dismissed the thought as a flight of fancy, a phantom of stress from the day's events. Meanwhile, in seat 34E of the same aircraft, Patty Carmichael was stewing in a cauldron of her own making. Squeezed between a college student who had fallen asleep on her shoulder and a large man who kept sighing heavily, she was experiencing a personal hell. The indignity was unbearable. Her husband, Robert, sat beside her in 34D, his face buried in a copy of the Wall Street Journal, refusing to meet her furious gaze. "I cannot believe you let that happen," she seethed in a harsh whisper. "What was I supposed to do?" "Patty," Robert whispered back, not lowering his paper. "Challenge her to a duel. She bought the damn plane. We should have just kept our mouths shut." "Our mouths? I was the one who was being made to feel uncomfortable. You did nothing. You felt uncomfortable because a black woman was sitting near you in first class. That's what this is about, and you know it. For once in your life, can you just see how this looks? It looks like I was asserting my rights. It looks like you're a bigot with a big mouth and a terrible sense of timing." He snapped his voice dangerously low. "We are guests of Omnicorp in New York. I have the biggest deal of my career on the line tomorrow. My reputation, my bonus, our entire financial future for the next 5 years is tied to this Alethea Dynamics acquisition. I needed to arrive in New York calm and prepared. Instead, I'm flying here in a middle seat next to a snoring sophomore because my wife decided to start a civil rights incident at 30,000 feet. Patty fell silent, stung by the venom in his words. She hadn't considered his meeting. Her world rarely extended beyond her own comforts and grievances. She spent the rest of the flight in stony, miserable silence. When the plane landed at JFK, the final humiliation was yet to come. As the economy passengers shuffled forward to deplane, they had to pass through the empty, pristine first-class cabin. There, in seat 2B, sat Dr. Evelyn Reed, calmly packing her laptop into its case. She didn't look up as Patty and Robert passed, but she didn't have to. Her very presence was a testament to the outcome of their conflict. Patty's face burned with shame as she hurried down the jet bridge, refusing to look back. The story, however, did not end when the passengers dispersed. A passenger in seat 3A, a tech blogger named Leo Kim, who had witnessed the initial confrontation, had been discreetly typing on his phone before he moved back to economy. By the time Evelyn was in a town car, heading to her hotel in Manhattan, his blog post was live. The headline was electric. Racism at 30,000 feet. CEO buys out first class after passenger demands black woman be moved. Leo didn't know Evelyn's name, nor Patty's. He referred to them as the Lady in Blue and the Kashmir Complainer. He recounted the dialogue he'd overheard Patty's use of the word unsafe and the stunning, audacious purchase of the entire cabin. He framed it as a story of modern-day justice of someone with the means to refuse to be victimized. The post exploded. It was picked up by Twitter aggregators, then by digital news outlets. Within 3 hours, it was trending nationally. At a first-class fracas and #flying. While black were everywhere. The internet, a vast and relentless detective agency, immediately set to work. Commenters who were on the flight added details. Someone had a blurry photo of Patty berating the flight attendant. Another had managed to get a picture of Evelyn sitting alone in the cabin. By the time Evelyn checked into the Carlisle Hotel, her phone was buzzing incessantly. Marcus had texted her a link to an article on Mashable. "Marcus, you've gone viral. Oh boy. This is a thing now." Evelyn clicked the link and felt a wave of nausea. Her act of private defiance had become a public spectacle. Then she scrolled down to the comments section. The internet sleuths had been busy. Someone had run the blurry photo of Patty through facial recognition software and cross-referenced it with social media. A new comment appeared, posted only minutes before. "The woman in the picture is Patricia Carmichael. I know her from the club in Greenwich. Her husband is some big-shot exec. Robert Carmichael." Evelyn froze her phone, clutched in her hand. Robert P. Carmichael, the CFO of Omnicorp. The world was, it turned out, exactly that small. And the most important meeting of her life had just become a minefield. The name on the screen, Robert P. Carmichael, seemed to burn with a cold blue light. Evelyn sank onto the edge of the plush, king-sized bed in her hotel suite, the view of Central Park's glittering evening skyline completely forgotten. This was no longer a personal incident. It was a corporate crisis of epic proportions, waiting to detonate. The woman whose bigotry had prompted her to spend a fortune on airline seats was the wife of the man who held the key to her company's future. The irony was so thick, so cruelly perfect, it was almost literary. Her first instinct was to call Marcus and panic. Her second, the one forged in years of high-stakes negotiations, was to analyze the threat matrix. Threat 1. Robert Carmichael knows. If he knew his wife was the Kashmir complainer from the viral story, he might preemptively sabotage the deal out of spite or to protect his family's reputation. He could paint Alethea Dynamics, and by extension Evelyn, as litigious aggressive or difficult to work with. Threat 2. Robert Carmichael doesn't know. This was almost worse. Evelyn would have to walk into that boardroom tomorrow and sit across from the husband of her antagonist. Could she maintain her composure? Could she negotiate in good faith with a man whose family life was intertwined with such a painful personal insult? If the truth came out mid-negotiation, the fallout would be catastrophic. Threat 3. Omnicorp finds out from a third party. The story was viral. The names were out there. It was only a matter of time before a journalist or a curious Omnicorp employee connected Robert P. Carmichael, CFO, with Patricia Carmichael, wife of a big-shot exec. The corporation would be plunged into a PR nightmare. Their acquisition of a company founded by a prominent black woman specializing in ethical AI would look like a desperate, cynical attempt at damage control. They would likely kill the deal instantly to distance themselves from the scandal. Every scenario led to the same conclusion: the acquisition was in mortal danger. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight after dialing his number. "We have a problem. A 5-alarm company-ending fire of a problem." She explained the connection. On the other end of the line, there was a long, stunned silence. No, Marcus finally breathed. "No, that's not possible. That's a soap opera plot. It's our plot now," Evelyn said, pacing the room. "What do we do? Do I call him? Do I call the CEO? Arthur Vance? Do I walk into that meeting tomorrow and pretend I don't know? If you call now, you look like you're threatening him." Marcus reasoned, his mind clicking into crisis mode. "If you walk in and pretend you risk an explosion, the best option, maybe the only option, is to get ahead of it. You have to call Arthur Vance. Tonight." Arthur Vance was the CEO of Omnicorp, a titan of the industry. Getting him on the phone after hours would be a feat in itself. But it was the only move. She had to control the narrative. "I'll frame it as a matter of professional transparency," Evelyn strategized aloud. "I'll inform him that I was the subject of a viral incident, and I have reason to believe their CFO's wife was the other party involved. I'll state that I have no intention of letting it affect our business, but felt he should be aware before it became a public liability for Omnicorp. It was a perfect corporate speak approach. It positioned her as the responsible party, the one thinking of the shareholders, while subtly laying the grenade on their boardroom table for them to deal with." "Do it," Marcus said. "Godspeed, Evelyn." Across town, in another luxury hotel, the atmosphere was funereal. Robert Carmichael had seen the articles. He had seen the name Patricia Carmichael trending on Twitter next to words like racist and Karen. He felt a cold dread seeping into his bones. His wife, in a single act of petty prejudice, had potentially torched his career. "What have you done, Patty?" he asked, his voice eerily calm, as he stood by the window staring down at the city lights. He held his tablet, the screen glowing with a news report. "It's all lies." "They're twisting it," she sobbed from the couch where she'd been crying for the past hour. "I was the victim." "The victim?" He spun around his face a mask of cold fury. The victim of what? A successful black woman having the audacity to sit in a seat she paid for. You picked a fight with the wrong person, Patty. She didn't just have money. She had class. And you showed none. Now the entire world is watching. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Omnicorp's Chief Communications Officer. CCO Robert, I need to speak with you urgently. Are you aware of a story trending about an incident on a United flight? Robert's blood ran cold. It was happening. They know Patty, he said, his voice a dead whisper. They know. Before he could respond, his hotel phone rang. The concierge. Mr. Carmichael. I have Arthur Vance on the line for you. He says it's urgent. Arthur Vance, the CEO, calling him directly at 9 p.m. Robert felt his stomach drop. With a trembling hand, he picked up the phone. Robert Vance's voice was clipped all business. I trust you're prepared for the Alethea meeting tomorrow. This is the biggest acquisition of the year for us. Everything has to be flawless. Yes, Arthur. Of course. I've gone over the final terms. Good, Vance cut him off. One other thing. We're getting some strange media inquiries. Something about an incident on a flight from SFO. A passenger named Patricia Carmichael. Any relation? It was the question Robert had been dreading his entire life. The one where his wife's behavior finally had a direct, measurable consequence on his professional world. He could lie, but the truth was a ticking bomb. He took a deep breath. Arthur, Patricia is my wife. There's been a misunderstanding. There was a long, dangerous silence on the other end of the line. A misunderstanding, Vance repeated, his voice now glacial. Is that what you call it when your wife is the star of a viral story about harassing a black woman? And do you know who the other woman in that story is, Robert? The woman your wife tried to have kicked out of first class. Robert's heart stopped. Who Dr. Evelyn Reed Vance said, and each word was a nail in the coffin of Robert's career. The founder and CEO of Alethea Dynamics. The woman you are supposed to be negotiating a $500 million acquisition with tomorrow morning. Robert Carmichael sank into a chair, the phone slipping from his grasp. The world wasn't just small, it was a perfectly designed trap, and he and his wife had just walked right into it. The Omnicorp boardroom on the 50th floor was less a room than a declaration. A single colossal slab of polished mahogany served as the table, its surface so immaculate it perfectly reflected the sweeping panorama of the Manhattan skyline outside and the tense, pale faces of the men and women seated around it. The air itself felt curated cool still and heavy with the scent of money and unspoken anxiety. At the head of this formidable table sat Arthur Vance, the CEO of Omnicorp. He was a man who seemed carved from the same granite as the city's skyscrapers, all sharp angles, grey tones, and immovable presence. His face was a study in controlled neutrality, yet his eyes, cold and focused, betrayed a simmering anger. To his left, in the seat of honor, typically reserved for the deal's architect, sat Robert P. Carmichael. Robert was a ruin. His exquisitely tailored suit, usually a suit of armor, now hung on him like a shroud. His face was ashen. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly where they lay on the table, and his eyes darted about the room, finding no comfort. Only the cold, judgmental stares of his colleagues. The board members, a gallery of corporate power, whispered amongst themselves, their voices low, but their contempt palpable. They looked at Robert not as a peer who had stumbled, but as a contaminant that needed to be purged. The Alethea Dynamics acquisition was meant to be his magnum opus. Instead, he had become the single greatest liability to its success. "Pull yourself together, Robert." Vance murmured, his voice a low growl that carried no warmth, only a command. "Our guests will be here momentarily." Robert swallowed hard, nodding mutely. He looked like a man standing on a gallows of his own construction, waiting for the trap door to spring. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the grand double doors at the far end of the room swung open silently. Every whisper ceased. Every head turned. Dr. Evelyn Reed entered, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. She was not just a person entering a space. She was a force imposing its will upon it. Dressed in an elegant charcoal grey dress that was both severe and graceful, she radiated an aura of unshakable composure. Her posture was erect, her steps measured and confident. Beside her, Marcus Vance mirrored her calm, his presence a quiet bastion of support. There was no trace of the turmoil from the previous day. No hint of the personal insult that formed the invisible toxic substrate of this meeting. Arthur Evelyn said, her voice clear and steady as she approached the head of the table. She extended her hand not as a supplicant, but as an equal. "Thank you for seeing us, Doctor." "Doctor." Reed Vance replied, his own voice a respectful baritone, as he shook her hand. "The pleasure is all ours. Please." He gestured to the seats directly across from him and his CFO. Evelyn took her seat, placing her leather-bound portfolio on the table before her. For a single charged moment, her eyes met Robert Carmichael's across the polished expanse. The gulf between them was wider than the few feet of mahogany. In his gaze, she saw a lifetime of regret compressed into a single, desperate second. It was a chaotic plea for mercy, for understanding, for a way out of the abyss he now found himself in. Evelyn's response was a masterwork of control. Her expression did not flicker. There was no anger, no hint of triumph, satisfaction. She held his gaze for a beat, and in that beat she did not see the husband of her tormentor. She saw a data point, a flawed variable in a corrupted system. A man whose silent complicity in small evils had led him to this catastrophic failure. Her calm was not an absence of feeling. It was a conscious, disciplined refusal to engage on the level of personal grievance. She was here as the CEO of Alethea Dynamics, and her internal calculus was cold, clear, and absolute. The dismissal in her professional neutrality was more devastating than any shouted accusation could ever have been. Robert flinched, looking away, first his face burning with a shame so profound it was almost visible. Arthur Vance let the silence hang for a moment longer before clearing his throat. "Well," he began, his corporate smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We are all here to finalize what I believe is a landmark moment for Omnicorp. The acquisition of Alethea Dynamics represents a bold leap into the future of ethical technology." He spoke for a minute about synergy and shareholder value, the standard preamble to such a momentous signing. Every word was a stone laid carefully on the path to Robert's execution. He was magnifying the scale of the opportunity, underscoring the magnitude of what had been jeopardized. Then his tone shifted. "Before we proceed to the final signatures, however," Vance said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "an external matter has come to my attention. A matter that strikes at the very heart of our corporate identity." He paused, letting the statement permeate the tense atmosphere. Every board member sat straighter. Vance turned his gaze fully upon Evelyn. Dr. Reed, he said, his voice now filled with a carefully calibrated sincerity. Last night you acted with a level of professionalism and transparency that I have seldom witnessed. You alerted me to a potentially damaging public story, aware that it might involve a member of our Omnicorp family. You did so not with threats or demands, but with a quiet dignity that speaks volumes about your character, and by extension the character of the company you have built. I and the entire board thank you for that. It was a brilliant move, publicly aligning Omnicorp with Evelyn's integrity before he wielded it as a weapon. He then swiveled his head, a slow, deliberate motion, until his glacial eyes were locked on his CFO. Robert Vance's voice dropped, becoming lethally soft, a stiletto wrapped in velvet. Dr. Reed was, shall we say, diplomatic in her assessment. I, on the other hand, have had the distinct displeasure of reading the news reports, of seeing the eyewitness accounts, of viewing a rather unflattering and now globally recognized photograph of your wife, Patricia. He let the name hang in the air. Robert visibly shrank in his chair. Your wife, Vance, continued, his voice rising slightly. Each word, dripping with contempt, felt uncomfortable on a flight from San Francisco. She felt unsafe. She felt entitled enough to demand that another paying passenger be removed from her seat to assuage these feelings. And in doing so, she has brought a firestorm of negative publicity and public revulsion to our doorstep. He leaned forward. This deal, Robert, this $500 million deal was to be your legacy, your crowning achievement here. It was meant to secure this company's future for the next decade. Instead, you and your family have managed to tarnish our brand in less than 12 hours. We are Omnicorp. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year cultivating an image of a diverse, inclusive, forward-thinking global leader. The notion that we would be associated in any way with the kind of cheap, vulgar country club prejudice your wife displayed on that aircraft is an existential threat to that image. It is brand poison. Vance finally delivered the killing blow, his voice ringing with theatrical finality. And do you know who the other woman in that story is, Robert? The brilliant, accomplished black woman, whom your wife tried to have ejected from her rightful place. The board deserves to know exactly who was being made to feel unsafe. He gestured across the table. It was Dr. Evelyn Reed, the founder and CEO of Alethea Dynamics. A collective sharp intake of breath circled the table as the final puzzle piece clicked into place. The vague scandal was now a specific, horrifying, and deeply personal corporate nightmare. Robert finally broke. Arthur. Please, he stammered, his voice cracking. It was a misunderstanding, a terrible mistake, Patty. She didn't mean. Enough. Vance snapped his voice like a whip crack. The facade of civility was gone, replaced by pure, cold power. Your wife's intentions are irrelevant. The consequences are not. He straightened his tie, his face an impassive mask once more. Robert Carmichael. Your employment with Omnicorp is terminated effective immediately. Please surrender your company ID and phone to my assistant. Security will escort you from the building. We will have your personal effects couriered to your home. It was corporate execution, swift, merciless, and absolute. Robert stood up on unsteady legs, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He didn't look at Evelyn. He didn't look at Vance. He looked at nothing. His eyes hollowed out, a ghost already erased from the corporate photograph. He turned and walked the long walk to the door, a broken man whose life had just been publicly dismantled. As the heavy door swung shut behind him, a funereal silence descended on the room. Arthur Vance waited a beat, then smoothed his tie. His expression utterly unchanged. He turned back to Evelyn, a flicker of a smile on his lips, as if the last 5 minutes had been a minor housekeeping matter. "Now then, Dr. Reed," he said briskly, "a regrettable but necessary piece of business. Shall we proceed with the acquisition?" This was the moment, the culmination of her life's work. The deal was on the table, the money was real, her antagonist had been vanquished. All she had to do was pick up the pen. But as Evelyn looked at Vance, she felt a profound chill. He hadn't acted out of moral conviction. He hadn't fired Robert Carmichael because racism was wrong. He had fired him because he was a liability. He had treated bigotry like a line item on a balance sheet, a risk to be managed, a threat to the stock price to be neutralized. He hadn't cleansed his house. He had merely swept a mess under the rug, while the foundation remained rotten. She thought of Aletheia, her company, named for the Greek spirit of truth and sincerity. Could she, in good conscience, sell it to this machine? A machine so cold, so clinical, that it could pivot from a man's professional execution to a business transaction in a single breath. She took a deep breath, drawing strength from her convictions. "Arthur," she said, her voice quiet but resonant, filling the silent room. "I appreciate your decisive action. I truly do." She placed her hands flat on the table and slowly pushed the thick, leather-bound contract back to the center, an inch at a time. It was a small movement with the force of an earthquake. "But I'm afraid this meeting has been very illuminating," she continued. "It has revealed a fundamental misalignment of corporate culture. Aletheia Dynamics is more than an algorithm, more than a product. It's a philosophy. And I have come to realize that philosophy would not survive here. It would be diluted, compromised, and ultimately erased." She stood up, and Marcus, his face a mask of pride, rose with her. Therefore she concluded her words, delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. "We are respectfully withdrawing our company from consideration for acquisition. We will remain independent." She gave a slight formal nod. To the stunned faces around the table, turned and walked out of the boardroom. She left behind a $500 million deal, lying dead on the table, a CEO sputtering in disbelief, and the lingering ghost of a man who had lost everything. Evelyn Reed had come to New York to sell her company, but in the end, she had refused to sell its soul. The heavy boardroom door clicked shut behind them, muffling the stunned silence they had left in their wake. As they walked down the long, silent corridor toward the elevators, Marcus Vance finally let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an eternity. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and sheer terror. "You just walked away from $500 million. You do realize that, right?" Evelyn didn't slow her pace. Her heels clicked with a steady, resolute rhythm on the marble floor. "I realize," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a new, hard-won clarity, "that I just saved our company from being worth $500 million. There's a difference." Inside the elevator, as it began its silent, swift descent from the corporate stratosphere, she finally leaned her head against the cool steel wall. The adrenaline of the confrontation began to recede, replaced by a profound weariness and an even more profound sense of rightness. She hadn't just made a business decision. She had honored the core principle upon which Aletheia Dynamics was built, that ethics weren't a feature to be added, but the foundation upon which everything else stood. Selling to Omnicorp would have been like building a palace on a toxic waste dump. The fallout was not just immediate, it was a detonation in the public square. In the hours that followed, the story morphed at lightning speed. The first wave of reports, driven by leaks from within Omnicorp, focused on the firing. Omnicorp CFO Ousted amid scandal screamed the headlines on financial news terminals. It was a story of corporate house cleaning designed to make Arthur Vance look decisive. But then the second, more powerful wave hit. An anonymous source, likely a junior board member deeply impressed by Evelyn, leaked the truth. By midday, the narrative had been completely rewritten. Principles over profit. Alethea CEO. Rejects $500. Omnicorp deal. After racism scandal ran the banner on TechCrunch. The story was no longer about a disgraced executive. It was about an inspirational leader. Evelyn Reed was transformed from a victim into a visionary. She was lauded in opinion pieces and across social media as a new icon of corporate integrity. She hadn't just fought back. She had refused the spoils of a tainted war. The phone at Alethea Dynamics began ringing and didn't stop. The calls weren't from journalists anymore. They were from the titans of Silicon Valley. Legendary venture capital firms that had been watching her from a distance now saw a once-in-a-generation leader. They saw her rejection of Omnicorp not as a risk, but as the ultimate proof of her brand's value. Within 6 months, Evelyn closed a new round of funding led by one of the most respected firms on Sand Hill Road. The deal valued Alethea Dynamics at nearly $1 billion, double the Omnicorp offer, and most importantly, left Evelyn firmly in control. Her act of defiance on Flight 2447 had become the most powerful and unintentional marketing campaign in modern tech history. For the Carmichaels, the karma was not a gentle teacher. It was a slow, suffocating avalanche. Robert was radioactive. In the tight-knit world of C-suite executives, he was a pariah. The story was too memorable, too toxic. No board would risk hiring a man whose name was inextricably linked to such a public and sordid scandal. His calls went unreturned. Former colleagues and friends averted their gazes at the few industry events he dared to attend. The 9-figure bonus tied to the Alethea deal evaporated, and a morality clause in his contract, a bit of boilerplate he'd never imagined would apply to him, was invoked to claw back previous year's stock options. The sprawling estate in Greenwich, once Patty's proud kingdom, became a gilded cage of their own failure. The phone calls Patty received were no longer invitations, but whispers of gossip. Her friends, whose own prejudices were merely quieter versions of hers, scattered like birds, terrified of being tainted by association. She was no longer just Patty. She was that woman from the plain, the living embodiment of a cautionary tale. They sold the house at a loss, then the vacation home in Aspen, then the art. Each sale was a fresh humiliation, stripping away another layer of the identity they had spent their lives curating. One rainy afternoon, about a year after the incident, Evelyn was sitting in a quiet cafe in her Hayes Valley neighborhood. The city was wrapped in a soft gray mist, and the aroma of roasted coffee filled the air. She was a different woman now, no less driven, but imbued with a sense of peace that had been absent before. She was idly flipping through a local paper when a small block text notice in the public records section caught her eye. It was a declaration of bankruptcy. The names listed were Robert P. and Patricia L. Carmichael. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest. She read the names again, a cold finality settling over her. There was no joy, no triumphant surge of they got what they deserved. There was only a profound and quiet sadness. She had never wished for their ruin. She had only demanded her own dignity. The intricate, cruel machine that had ground their lives to dust was a machine of their own design. Patty's prejudice was the gear that set it in motion. Robert's silent, enabling complicity was the oil that kept it running. The world had simply provided the inevitable grinding conclusion. "Can I get you anything else, Dr. Reed?" "Read 'em?" a young waitress asked, her eyes shining with an unmistakable look of admiration. She was one of the many who now recognized her. Evelyn looked up from the paper, the ghost of the Carmichael's fate still lingering in her mind, and offered a warm, genuine smile. "No, thank you," she said, her voice soft. "I have everything I need." She had her company. She had her integrity. She had her soul. And she had a flight to London that evening for the opening of Alethea's European headquarters. Weeks ago, her assistant had asked about her flight preference. Evelyn's instructions had been simple and immediate: book the entire first-class cabin. It was not an act of spite or a display of power. It was a lesson learned and paid for an insurance policy against the world's chaos. She had learned that sometimes the only way to guarantee your peace is to build your own quiet space, and she had more than earned the right to do so. This story is a stark reminder that karma isn't a mystical force. It's the logical, often brutal conclusion of our own actions. Patricia Carmichael's prejudice set off a chain reaction that consumed her own life, while Dr. Evelyn Reed's unwavering dignity became the foundation for even greater success. It shows that the true cost of hatred is always paid by the person who harbors it. What do you think? Was Evelyn's response justified? Was Omnicorp's decision fair, or just corporate damage control? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These are the conversations we need to be having. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into stories that matter. Thank you for listening.